Hi everyone, I'm Eric Alden. The genre of horror is one of the most fascinating to think about because you don't typically associate it with all those other positive emotions everyone seems to be so obsessed with, right? So you go watch a comedy to laugh. You watch a romance to set the mood. You watch a superhero movie to remind yourself that the good guy always wins in the end. Well, that kind of begs the question, why do you go and watch horror? Well, there are many different answers to that question, but for me it's because it combines the darker parts of humanity and life, and it combines them with art in a way that it beautifies them. So because horror is so young, we're talking less than 300 years, right? This genre is very new as far as humanity is concerned. There have been very few people to be able to really make a name for themselves. Right, we've all heard of Poe, Lovecraft, Stoker, we've all heard of Kuntz, but how many people have heard of Franz Kafka? Probably not very many. So today we're going to be looking at Franz Kafka's work and how it relates to his life. Franz Kafka was born in Prague on July 3, 1883. His father was a successful business owner with a domineering personality which later played a large role in his writing. His mother was a well-educated woman from a decent family. Kafka's parents provided a comfortable middle-class life for their 4 children. Kafka found a lot of success in his studies. On one occasion, he had taught himself Greek to be able to read Plato's Protagoras, and another time French to read The Temptation of St. Anthony. He earned the title of Doctor of Law in 1906, however, the first job he got was difficult and required him to work long hours. After a few months of that, he got a better position at an insurance agency that dealt with worker injuries and compensation. This was a booming field at the time due to poor safety precautions for workers. This job shaped much of his opinion on bureaucracy and government stupidity. He hated this job and thought of it as nothing more than a job to keep bread on the table. He spent most of his free time writing, which he took very seriously. When World War I broke out, he was drafted for service, but his employers prevented him from fighting, stating that his work was necessary for government function. 2 years later, he tried joining the military, but was rejected due to his problems with tuberculosis. There were a number of women he was romantically involved with. His friends even described him as a womanizer, but he never married and spent most of his life in isolation. After his illness had worsened, he was stuck living in TB hospitals, otherwise known as sanatoriums. In 1924, his TB had become unbearable. He was unable to eat or drink as his throat was nearly closed from the infection. Kafka died in June, an unknown writer, editing a hunger artist on his deathbed. He had not finished a single full-length novel and destroyed roughly 90% of his own work. He left all his writings, letters, and stories to his friend, Max Brod, with strict instructions to burn it all. Thankfully, Brod disobeyed and published everything. The first story I want to talk about is In the Penal Colony. This story does a good job of showing Kafka's worldview and even his political opinions. The Penal Colony is about an unknown colony that a European explorer visits. This European explorer is simply known as the Explorer. He's more of an upper class kind of person, and he probably looks down on the people who live in the colony. Then there's the officer. The officer is obsessed with tradition and justice, So when the colony was created, the founder made a machine to punish people accused of crimes. Anyone accused of a crime on the colony was automatically guilty, and they didn't tell you what you were guilty of. Then, the machine would use hundreds of needles and write what you were guilty of on your back. That terrible process went on for 12 hours, and by the end, you died. The people of the colony realized this wasn't the best justice system in the world, and it became very unpopular in the colony. The officer was the only person who still defended it. The other two characters in the story are the prisoner, who doesn't know what he's been accused of, and a soldier whose job it is to guard the prisoner. The officer begs the explorer to defend the machine, but the explorer sees it for what it is. So eventually the explorer convinces the new leader of the colony that they should get rid of that terrible machine. The officer frees the prisoner and sets up the machine for himself with the words "Be just" to be written on his back. He goes into the machine, but it glitches, and instead of the typical 12-hour torture, it stabs the officer and he dies instantly. The explorer then visits the grave of the founder, where it says, "One day he will rise from the grave and take control of the colony again." After that, the explorer is done with the colony, and he goes back to his boat to go home. When the soldier and the prisoner try to go with him, the explorer fights them off so they can't come with him. So the most common way to interpret this story is as a religious critique. And because this is Europe in the early 1900s, there are really two big religions on people's minds, and that's Christianity and Judaism. Now let's say the founder represents the Old Testament God, or Yahweh, right? He's the leader of the Jews, the old way of doing things. Well, that means that the new leader of the colony, he represents Jesus, right? Out with the old, in with the new. Out with the old barbaric system, in with the new, turn the other cheek, forgiving kind of thing, right? That's kind of how the story can be interpreted. And it actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because as most of you out there probably know, Yahweh is much more vengeful. He's much more interested in punishment, right? He could, if you're speaking for the Old Testament God, let's say, there's a lot of overlap between him and the founder of the colony, right? He would probably look at the torture instrument and say, hey, that's not a bad idea. I mean, it's kind of scary to think about, but, there's an argument to be made there. And that's very much opposed to, the new leader of the colony. Out, like I said, out with the old, in with the new, and it really does make a lot of sense. And I find this way to interpret this story to be one of the most interesting, because Franz Kafka's Jewish, right? He was an Ashkenazi Jew, he was a practicing Jew, and even though he considered himself to not really fit in with the Jewish people, he did consider himself, at the end of the day, a Jew. And it's weird that he would write this very, almost critical work against the Old Testament God and the Jewish, I wouldn't say the Jewish people, but Yahweh, the old way of doing things as a whole. The Metamorphosis is especially interesting when you begin to see how much of Kafka's personal life was injected into this story. There are quite a few similarities, and it really says a lot about not only him, but people around him as well, especially family members. One day, a traveling salesman named Gregor Samsa wakes up in his bed, unable to move. He realizes he's been turned into a giant insect. He quickly loses his job as he can't even speak, which becomes a problem because he was providing for his entire family, which includes both his parents and his sister. His sister takes it upon herself to feed him, but after turning into an insect, Gregor realizes he has no taste for anything he used to like, and can only tolerate eating rotten table scraps. His entire family is forced to get jobs, which still only covers the bare minimum. They find themselves in a tricky situation because it still isn't enough money to cover their expenses. They find themselves renting out a room in their apartment to 3 strange bearded men, while Gregor's sister is forced to sleep on the couch in the living room. Gregor stays in his bedroom throughout most of the story and almost never leaves. Since Gregor is trapped in there, he becomes more depressed by the day because he's forced to listen to his family complain about the financial burden. One day, his mother decided to visit him, but she faints due to his horrible appearance. Gregor's father comes home from work and misinterprets the situation, thinking that Gregor had attacked his mother. The father severely injures Gregor and throws an apple on his back, which remains stuck in there. A few days later, the 3 bearded men spot Gregor and announce that they're not going to pay rent anymore because of the disgusting living conditions. Gregor's sister tells the parents that they must get rid of Gregor or the entire family will be ruined. She says the insect isn't Gregor anymore because if it was, he would have left on his own accord and not have burdened the family so much. Gregor, realizing the gravity of the situation, goes back into his room and kills himself. When the family discovers Gregor's death, they take a trolley car into town to celebrate, where they discuss plans of moving into a better apartment and finding Gregor's sister a husband. And that's how the story ends. So one of the biggest themes in this story is that of isolation. Now, Gregor Samsa worked as a traveling salesman. So he goes around, he has a bunch of shallow relationships, he doesn't really connect with people on a deep level, and he's just working this job that he hates to take care of his family. Right, so that's basically his life. He's sacrificing his own future in some ways, because he's not planning on leaving or making a family of his own. He's working pretty much all his time, with very few hobbies or anything outside of that, to take care of his family, his parents, and his sister. And when he becomes a bug, he becomes even isolated from them. So when he's working this job, he's alone, he's disconnected from the world, but he at least has his family to fall back on. He has some kind of in-group. Now when he becomes a bug, it takes that away. He doesn't have any in-group. He's basically disconnected and isolated from everything there is, even himself in some ways. And the way his family reacts actually could say something about the way Franz Kafka's family actually treated him. So in the story Gregor Samsa, when he becomes the bug, his father very quickly sees him as he's just this monster, he's a bug, that's not my son. That's more or less how his father reacts. His mother, she's torn between the feeling of sympathy for her son, hoping that one day he comes back or he's fixed or he's, back to normal someday, he's not a bug anymore. And, the kind of the truth, because she is mortified. The first time in the story she actually sees him as a bug in person, she faints. And then his sister, she sympathizes in the beginning, but by the end of the story, she sees him as nothing more than as a chore and as a nuisance. Another important theme I want to briefly talk about is the mind-body disconnect. Now, Gregor Samsa's body has been changed completely. He's not the same person physically anymore. He's totally a bug. He can't even speak anymore. And part 2 of the story mostly deals with him trying to retain or trying to hold on to the little bit of humanity he still has left. But it is fading fast. He can't eat the same foods. He can't use the same furniture. He can't even walk around or move the same way he did when he was a person. And there's absolutely nothing he can do about it. Even before he contracted tuberculosis, Kafka was a sickly man. He suffered from anxiety, depression, insomnia, and migraines most of his life. But there's another aspect to the mind-body disconnect. Kafka also repressed his sexual desires quite a bit. His friend, Max Brod, once described Kafka as being tortured by his sexual desires. There's also a number of documented affairs Kafka was involved in. He was also said to be fascinated by pornography, but he never married, and he never even had a significant relationship with a woman. He was engaged to Phyllis Bauer twice, but both times ended in shambles. No one really knows why he never went through with the marriage. Some people have guessed that he was gay, but that probably isn't the case. The real reason he repressed his rampant sexuality was due to his fear of STDs, which was a common thing during the time. Something like syphilis, well, back then, it would kill you, so it was important to avoid sex at all costs. So between the sexual frustrations and actual illnesses, he found it hard to do the one thing he cared about most: writing. Franz Kafka was noted for being a quiet man. He had very few friends and a constant desire to belong to something. That's probably the reason he tried joining the military in 1917. Kafka was also an Ashkenazi Jew, and he found comfort in participating in Jewish culture at the time. However, he still considered himself an atheist and never felt like he truly belonged with the Jews. He once wrote,
"What have I in common with Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself, and should stand very quietly in a corner, content that I can breathe."
As much as he wanted to have some kind of a tribe of his own, he just never fit in. This was all the worse for him because Europe was becoming more and more anti-Semitic at the time. Many believed in conspiracy theories that Jews controlled all of European finance, politics, and media. Jews were tragically targeted in Europe for hundreds of years, often resulting in being attacked or run out of the country, such as in Russia throughout the 1800s. This often led to Jewish communities being highly isolated, which only made the tensions between Jews and non-Jews all that more worse. This was especially bad for Kafka because he didn't fit in with his own community, and he wasn't going to be accepted anywhere else either. On top of being isolated from society almost completely, he also felt this way at home amongst his own family. He had a bad relationship with his father, which probably created a dysfunctional household. In 1919, Kafka wrote a 45-page letter to his father, accusing him of being emotionally abusive and hypocritical. He also went into detail about being afraid of his father, and in fact, didn't even give the letter to him directly. He handed it to his mother to hand to his father. But Franz Kafka's mother was also afraid of her own husband, so instead of handing the letter to him, she gave it back to her own son. So he had a pretty bad life at home and no real cultural or ethnic identity. This all explains how someone could be capable of writing such a depressing story as the Metamorphosis.
The unhappiness of the bachelor, whether seeming or actual, is so early guessed at by the world around him that he will curse his decision, at least if he has remained a bachelor, because of the delight he takes in secrecy. He walks around with his coat buttoned, his hands in the upper pockets of his jacket, his arms akimbo, his hat pulled down over his eyes. A false smile that has become natural to him is supposed to shield his mouth, as his glasses do his eyes. His trousers are tighter than seem proper for his thin legs, but everyone knows his condition. This bachelor, still in the midst of his life, apparently of his own free will, will resign himself to an even smaller space. And when he dies, the coffin is exactly right for him.
Kafka was talking about himself here. He wrote this passage in 1911 while he was in his late 20s, and I can't help but draw the connection between the ending of Metamorphosis and those last few lines. And when he dies, the coffin is exactly right for him. That is an extremely dark and depressing thing to write, because remember, he's talking about himself here. He thinks that he belongs dead. And then you remember Gregor Samsa's family suddenly became happy after he died, and you have to wonder, you have to think to yourself, did Franz Kafka actually feel this way about himself in real life? Well, the sad thing is, he probably did. Now, I mentioned earlier how he had a strained relationship with his father, but I think that the Metamorphosis does a really good job of describing Kafka's relationship with his family as a whole. One time, when Kafka's mom was trying to get him to write a letter to his uncle, Kafka responded,
"He is a complete stranger to me. He misunderstands me entirely. He does not know what I want and need. I have nothing in common with him."
His mother replied,
"So, no one understands you. I suppose I'm a stranger to you too, and your father as well."
This is the kind of solitude that dominated his life, understood by few, judged, rejected, and ignored by many. A father who basically shoved him into a corner, and a family who couldn't do more than passively look him in the eye and pretend they were looking at their own blood. Kafka was getting more and more sick by 1924. Months before he finally passed away, he reached out to a friend who lived in Palestine, hoping to finally visit the Holy Land before his time came. Kafka's friend rejected him. This final rejection left Kafka feeling like nothing, and that's exactly how he'd go. Like nothing. He died editing A Hunger Artist on his deathbed in a sanatorium in Austria.
To die would mean nothing else than to surrender a nothing to the nothing. But that would be impossible to conceive, for how could a person, even only as a nothing, consciously surrender himself to the nothing, and not merely to an empty nothing, but rather to a roaring nothing, whose nothingness consists only in its incomprehensibility?